I have told this story exactly 3 times in my life. Once to an internal investigator who never called me back. Once to a priest who asked me to stop and pray instead. And once into a recorder I buried in a box at the back of my closet, because writing it down felt too permanent. If you are hearing this now, then that box is open. That already wasn't supposed to happen. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I am not a person who believes in things without explanations. I spent 23 years as a highway patrol officer in New Mexico. Night shifts, desert routes, long stretches, where the only thing keeping you awake is the sound of your own engine, and the knowledge that if something goes wrong, no one is coming quickly. I've pulled bodies out of wrecks that didn't make the news. I've stood on roads so hot they blurred the air and watched people realize too late they were lost. I know what exhaustion looks like. I know what panic sounds like over a radio. I know what happens when people swear they saw something they didn't. That's why this still matters. Because on the night this started, I wasn't tired. I wasn't chasing ghosts. I wasn't looking for anything strange. I was watching a car. And the car did not have a driver. If that sentence makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. It made me uncomfortable too. I replayed it in my head for years, trying to change the wording, trying to make it sound more reasonable. The car appeared to be unattended. The driver was not visible. The lighting conditions were poor. None of that is true. The car was driving itself. Before I continue, let me pause here for a moment. If you're the kind of person who listens to stories like this late at night, with the lights low or the screen face down, you might want to make sure you're subscribed now. Not because this channel needs it, but because stories like this don't come with neat endings, and you don't want to miss where this goes next. And while you're listening, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. City, country, highway, rest stop, somewhere you probably shouldn't be this late. I read every one. Now listen carefully. The desert at night is not empty. That's the first lie people tell about it. During the day it looks open, forgiving even. At night it closes in. The land doesn't move, but it feels like it leans closer, like it's listening. That night I was running a routine patrol along a stretch of highway that cuts south toward the cholla fields. You don't drive that road unless you mean to. There are no towns out there. No gas stations, just long blacktop, occasional reflectors, and miles of desert that all look the same until you're deep enough that turning around feels pointless. The call came in quiet. No urgency in dispatch's voice, just a report of a vehicle drifting off the roadway and correcting itself. No brake lights. No hazard flashers. Caller unsure if anyone was inside. That happens more than you'd think. Drunk drivers. Medical episodes. People falling asleep and waking up just in time. I acknowledged the call and turned off my music. That's another detail that bothers me. I remember the exact moment the cab went quiet. A few miles later, I saw the car. Older sedan. Light-colored, maybe silver or beige. The kind that blends into headlights until it's right in front of you. It was moving slower than highway speed, hugging the right side. Tires crossing the line and easing back like someone was distracted but careful. I pulled in behind it and waited for the telltale signs. Sudden acceleration. Erratic braking. Anything human. Instead, the car adjusted its speed to match mine. That's when I noticed the rearview mirror inside was angled down. Not toward a face, toward the empty seat. I told myself it was the lighting. Reflection. The angle of my cruiser. Not real. Real. Not real. I radioed in the plate. Static answered me first, then dispatch repeating my call sign slightly wrong, like they were reading it off a smudged page. I corrected them. They apologized. I don't remember them clearing the plate. The car ahead drifted right again. This time the tires crossed onto sand. I expected a correction. Instead it continued, smoothly, leaving the road entirely. No brake lights, no hesitation, just a controlled turn into the desert. I slowed, then stopped. Protocol says you don't follow a vehicle off-road without backup unless there's an immediate threat to life. Protocol also doesn't cover what to do when you are watching something that shouldn't be happening at all. I followed. The pavement ended quickly. Headlights cut narrow tunnels through cholla cactus that stood like crowds frozen mid-step. The car ahead weaved through them with precision, avoiding spines by inches. I remember thinking that whoever was driving knew the land well. Then I realized I still hadn't seen anyone. The engine sound ahead of me stayed constant. No strain, no revving, just steady motion, as if the car wasn't fighting the terrain at all. The radio crackled again. My own voice came back at me, half a second delayed, repeating the last thing I'd said. I shut it off. The car slowed. So did I. It felt like being watched by something that didn't need eyes. When the sedan finally stopped, it did so beside a dense stand of cholla so thick it swallowed the light. I parked at an angle, exited my cruiser and called out. Standard commands. Loud enough to carry, professional enough to convince myself this was still normal. No answer. The desert held its breath. I approached the driver's side. The door was unlocked. The seat was empty. The engine was warm, and as I stood there, staring into a car that had driven itself into a place no one accidentally goes, I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that this was not the first time it had done this. And that it would not be the last. Not real. Real. Not real. I didn't climb into the sedan. I want that on record. That sounds like something you shouldn't have to say, but people always assume the same thing when I tell them this. They imagine curiosity. They imagine a man leaning in, searching for clues, fingers brushing the steering wheel like it might twitch beneath his hand. No, I stood in the open driver's door and let my flashlight move slowly, methodically, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself you're in control. The cabin smelled wrong. Not rotten, not chemical. Just wrong in the way a room smells when it has been closed too long and the air inside doesn't match the air outside. A stale warmth clung to the upholstery, as if someone had been sitting there recently, breathing into that space, and stepped out only seconds before I arrived. But there were no footprints in the sand. That was the first real contradiction. The ground around the car was soft enough to show everything. Not just footprints, tire marks, dragged branches, the faint scuff of a boot toe. It's how the desert keeps record. It doesn't forget. Not unless wind comes hard and steady. And the wind that night was barely moving. I shined the light down and saw only the tire tracks from the sedan. 2 clean grooves that curved off the road and ended here. No other tracks beside them. No staggered prints coming from the driver's side. No wandering path into the cholla. Nothing. Just the car, sitting like it had been placed there. I stepped back and scanned the surrounding field. Cholla stood everywhere, dense and prickled, the kind people call jumping cactus. It doesn't actually jump. But it doesn't need to. You brush it and it clings to you, little barbed segments that hook into skin and fabric. Even animals avoid it if they can. The locals have stories about it. Not ghost stories, practical ones, mostly. Warnings disguised as folklore. Kids get told not to wander there because the cactus is hungry, because it likes warmth, because it will follow you home if you bring pieces of it with you. I never believed that. I was still in uniform, still wearing my duty belt, still thinking in procedure. Vehicle stop. Unknown occupant. Call for backup. Secure the scene. I walked back to my cruiser and tried the radio again. Only static, not the usual patchy desert interference. Not the thin hiss that clears when you adjust your mic. This was thick, pulsing static that rose and fell like something breathing behind it. I tried a different channel. Then another. Then the emergency band. Nothing. I checked my phone next. No service, which wasn't surprising, except the screen didn't just say no service. It flickered. The time kept changing, rolling forward and snapping back like it couldn't decide where it belonged. I turned it off. The desert has a way of making you feel alone, even when you aren't. But that night, with the radio dead and the sky heavy above me, I felt something sharper than isolation. I felt selected. I went back to the sedan and looked for anything that could explain it. A bag on the passenger seat. A jacket. A purse. Something human. There was nothing. The glove compartment was closed. The center console was closed. The windows were up. The keys were in the ignition. I reached toward them and stopped inches short, because a thought hit me so hard it almost felt like a voice. Don't. Not real. Real. Not real. I withdrew my hand and instead leaned in and checked the gear shift. It was in park. I checked the pedals. Clean. No mud. No sand. Like the car had never left pavement. I kept my flashlight beam low and found something small near the cup holder. A single thorn. Not from cholla. A long, pale spine from something else. Maybe a mesquite. It looked freshly snapped, like it had been broken off and dropped there. I stared at it longer than I should have. And then, I heard the sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a footstep. It was a faint mechanical tick, like an engine cooling down. I told myself it was the sedan's engine finishing its last heat cycle. But the sound wasn't coming from the sedan. It was coming from behind me. I turned fast enough that my flashlight beam jumped across the cholla and made it look like figures shifting in the dark. My cruiser was still where I left it. Still idling. Still facing the sedan. But the engine sound I was hearing was not my cruiser either. It was deeper. A low, steady purr, as if another vehicle was close by. Close enough that I should have seen headlights, should have seen movement, should have heard tires grinding sand. There was nothing. I stood there a long moment, listening. The sound faded. When it did, the desert seemed to exhale again. The thin wind returned. The cholla clicked softly as spines brushed one another. I swallowed and spoke out loud, because silence gets heavy if you let it. Hello. My voice sounded too loud, like it didn't belong out there. No answer. I returned to the sedan, and this time I looked harder at the details that didn't fit. The rearview mirror was still angled down toward the driver's seat. The seatbelt was unbuckled, but it wasn't lying naturally. It had been pulled out slightly, stretched across the seat like someone had held it, and then let it retract halfway. I pinched the belt between two fingers. It was warm. That shouldn't have been possible. I let it go and it snapped back with a clean, sharp sound that made me flinch. I stepped away from the door and circled the car, keeping my flashlight on the ground. The passenger side was identical. No signs. The trunk was shut. The license plate was dusty but readable. I wrote it down on my notepad. Old habit. Paper doesn't flicker. Paper doesn't lose signal. I started walking the tire tracks back toward the road, looking for anything I'd missed. A stumble mark. A place where the sedan might have paused. A sign someone had gotten out earlier. The tracks were unnervingly smooth, even. The kind you get when a car moves slow and controlled. At about 20 yards from the sedan, I stopped, because something had moved through the sand without leaving prints. A faint trough ran parallel to the tire marks for several feet, like something had been dragged, but not heavy enough to carve deep. It was shallow, a slight disturbance that caught my flashlight beam at the right angle. It veered closer toward the sedan, then disappeared where the sand hardened. I crouched and ran my fingers just above it, not touching, just following the line. My skin prickled. The air felt colder near that mark. And I don't mean the way night cools naturally. I mean sudden, localized cold. Like standing near an open freezer. I stood up quickly and looked around, scanning the cholla for movement. Still nothing. But my certainty was gone now. Not the certainty that I was alone. The certainty that whatever had happened here was explainable. I realized I kept glancing at the sedan, expecting to see a figure suddenly appear in the driver's seat, like my eyes would finally catch what they had missed. It stayed empty. Not real. Real. Not real. I walked back to the road and stood on the edge of pavement, looking out into the desert where the sedan sat like a dead thing. Then I did something I shouldn't have done. I turned off my cruiser's headlights. For one long second, everything disappeared. The stars were there, but they didn't help. The desert became a single black mass, and the sedan became nothing at all. In that darkness, I heard the engine again, right in front of me. Idling. Smooth. Patient. I snapped the headlights back on. The sedan was there. The cholla was there. And there, between the sedan and my cruiser, was a new set of tire tracks. Fresh. Not mine. They curved in from deeper desert, stopped near the sedan, then turned away and vanished into the cholla field where no vehicle could have gone without tearing itself apart. My mouth went dry. I stared at those tracks and tried to make my mind accept what my eyes were telling it. I hadn't heard a vehicle approach. I hadn't seen headlights. And yet, the sand held the record. Something came, something stopped, something left. I backed toward my cruiser without turning my back on the sedan. My hand hovered near my radio, useless, near my weapon, pointless. Then, as I reached the driver's door of my cruiser, the sedan's headlights turned on. Just like that. No click, no delay. A clean, steady bloom of light across the sand, and in that light, the rearview mirror inside the sedan lifted. Not a lot. Just enough to point toward me. I didn't move. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it later. They ask why I didn't run, why I didn't get back in my cruiser and leave, why I didn't call for help again even though the radio was dead. They imagine fear as something loud, sudden, something that pushes you. This was different. This was the kind of fear that presses down on you so evenly you don't realize you're pinned until you try to breathe deeper and can't. The sedan's headlights stayed on. Not high beams. Not flickering. Just steady, low illumination spreading across the sand and catching the lower spines of the cholla so they glimmered faintly, like wet glass. The rearview mirror remained angled toward me. I waited for it to move again. To adjust further, to tilt just a little more, enough to convince me I hadn't imagined it. It didn't. That somehow made it worse. I forced myself to look away and check my surroundings, because standing still too long in the desert can get you killed even when nothing strange is happening. Heat during the day, cold at night, disorientation, panic. I took a slow step backward and nearly stumbled, because the ground beneath my heel wasn't where I expected it to be. The sand had shifted, not enough to form a footprint, just enough that it felt recently disturbed, loose in a way that didn't match the rest of the terrain. I bent slightly and swept my flashlight beam down. There were marks now where there hadn't been before. Not tire tracks, not footprints. Impressions. As if something had stood there briefly, distributing its weight in a way that didn't align with legs or wheels. The sand was pressed down in an uneven oval, shallow but wide, like a shadow pressed into the ground. I straightened quickly and took another step back, closer to my cruiser. The sedan's engine turned over. Once, just enough to let me know it could. Then it went quiet again. I raised my flashlight and aimed it through the windshield. The interior remained empty. No hands on the wheel. No shape in the driver's seat. No movement except the faint sway of the seatbelt where it hung, as if disturbed by air that wasn't there. I realized then that I had stopped hearing the wind again. The cholla had gone still. Even the night insects had fallen silent. I have spent enough time outdoors to know that when everything goes quiet at once, it's not because nothing is happening. It's because something has arrived. I backed into my cruiser and opened the door without looking away from the sedan. My movements felt exaggerated, like I was underwater. I slid into the seat and shut the door, the sound too loud in the stillness. The familiar interior should have grounded me. The worn steering wheel. The faint smell of coffee and dust. The dashboard lights. Instead, it felt smaller than it should have, like the space inside had compressed. I turned the key and the engine responded immediately. That small, reliable sound almost made me laugh. I shifted into drive. The sedan's brake lights came on. They hadn't done that before. I froze again, my foot hovering between pedals. The sedan's brake lights stayed lit, glowing red against the pale sand. Not pulsing, not flickering. Waiting. I put my cruiser back into park. The brake lights turned off. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my fingers ached. Not real. Real, not real. I told myself this was a coincidence. A delayed electrical issue. A car with a failing system responding unpredictably. The desert messes with electronics. Heat warps things. Cold drains batteries. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't. I turned my headlights slightly to the left, angling them away from the sedan. The engine sound started again. Stronger this time. The sedan rolled forward a few feet. No driver. No steering correction. It stopped as cleanly as it had before. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. The part of my mind that handled reports and paperwork and internal reviews began to take over, desperate to assert control. I reached for my notepad and flipped to a fresh page. Date. Time. Location. My pen hesitated, then scratched numbers that immediately felt wrong. The time didn't match what my phone had shown before it flickered out. The stars overhead didn't match the hour they should have been in. I crossed it out and wrote the time again. It didn't look any better. I glanced up and saw that the sedan's headlights were no longer illuminating the same patch of ground. They had shifted. Not by much, just enough that the beam now cut across the path I had walked earlier, the smooth sand I'd inspected for footprints. The light revealed something I hadn't seen before. A line. Faint. Interrupted, leading away from the sedan and into the cholla. It wasn't deep enough to be a track. It wasn't clear enough to be a trail. It was like something had skimmed the surface, brushing the tops of the sand grains aside. I swallowed and opened my cruiser door again. The air outside felt heavier now, thick against my skin. I stepped out and stood beside the cruiser, careful not to move too far from it. The line continued into the cholla field, disappearing where the cactus grew too dense for the headlights to reach. I followed it with my eyes and felt a sudden irrational certainty that if I followed it with my body, I would not come back the same way. I didn't know why I felt that. I just did. My radio crackled. I jumped so hard my flashlight slipped in my hand. At first I thought it was just static again. Then a voice pushed through, thin and distorted, like it was traveling a long distance through something thick. Unit 7. Come in. The voice was mine. Not recorded, not echoed. It spoke in the tone I used when checking on someone else. Calm, professional, expectant. I lifted the radio slowly and held it away from my face. Unit 7, do you copy? I did not answer. The radio clicked again. We have a visual on the vehicle. My chest tightened. I looked around wildly, scanning the desert for another cruiser, another set of headlights. Anything. There was nothing. The radio continued. Proceed with caution. That was a phrase I had said hundreds of times. A phrase drilled into training. A phrase meant to steady nerves. Hearing it in my own voice, out here, directed at me, made my skin crawl. I turned the radio off and dropped it onto the passenger seat. The silence returned, thicker than before. The sedan's engine started fully this time. The headlights brightened, the front wheels turned. I watched, unable to look away, as the car slowly pivoted, aligning itself with the faint line leading into the cholla field. It paused. For a moment I had the overwhelming sense that it was waiting for something. For me. I took a step back toward my cruiser, shaking my head. No. The sedan began to move. Not fast. Not reckless. Deliberate. It eased forward, its tires slipping into the sand and following the line with impossible precision, entering the cholla where no sane driver would go. The cactus swallowed the headlights piece by piece, until only darkness remained. I stood there long after the engine sound faded, staring at the place where it had vanished. When I finally climbed back into my cruiser and turned the headlights toward the road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own tire tracks. They didn't just lead from the pavement to where I was parked. They looped. Over and over, circling the spot where the sedan had been, tightening each time, like I had been driving in slow, shrinking spirals without remembering it. I don't know how long I sat there. I don't know when the wind came back. I only know that when dawn finally broke, the tracks were gone. All of them, except one, leading off the road. Into the desert. Daylight should have made everything better. That's another lie people tell about the desert. They talk about how the sun reveals what the dark hides, how shadows retreat and fear with them. They don't tell you how daylight makes certain things harder to deny. When the sun came up, I was still sitting in my cruiser, engine running, hands resting uselessly on my thighs. I don't remember deciding to stay there through the night. I don't remember deciding anything after the sedan disappeared into the cholla. I only remember the slow, colorless shift as the sky went from black to bruised purple, then to that washed-out blue that never feels gentle in New Mexico. The first thing I noticed was the heat. It came fast, pressing through the windshield and turning the inside of the cruiser stale. Sweat trickled down my back, grounding me in my body again, reminding me that I was still here. The second thing I noticed was how normal everything looked. The cholla stood exactly where it should have. The sand lay smooth and pale. No headlights, no tracks, no disturbed ground. If someone had driven past on the highway and glanced over, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. That scared me more than the night had. I stepped out of the cruiser and walked the area slowly, forcing myself to be thorough. I followed procedure, because procedure is what keeps you from thinking too much. I found my own footprints near the cruiser, half faded by the early wind. I found the place where the sedan had been parked, identifiable only because the sand there felt slightly firmer, compressed in a way that suggested weight. But the tire tracks were gone, all of them, including the looping ones I remembered so clearly. I stood there, hands on my hips, staring down at the blank sand, and felt a dull pressure build behind my eyes. The kind of headache that doesn't throb, just sits there, heavy and patient. Not real. Real. Not real. I drove back to the highway and pulled onto the shoulder, watching the road wake up. A truck passed. Then another. A sedan heading north, windows down, music playing too loud. Life continuing exactly as it should. I checked in with dispatch again. This time, the radio worked. Unit 7. Go ahead. I gave my location and requested confirmation on the plate I'd run the night before. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Negative record on that plate, Unit 7. Are you sure you copied it correctly? I told them I was. They asked me to repeat it. I did. Another pause. That plate is registered to a vehicle scrapped 12 years ago. I closed my eyes. I asked for more details. VIN, owner, anything. Dispatch hesitated. Then read off a name I didn't recognize and a town hours away. Cause of scrapping listed as unrecoverable damage after off-road incident. I didn't ask what kind of incident. I knew. I filed a report that morning. Or at least, I tried to. The words wouldn't come out right. Every time I described the sedan, it sounded wrong. Vague, unconvincing. Like I was trying to explain a dream I didn't fully remember. My supervisor read it twice, then looked at me the way people do when they're deciding how gently they need to speak. He suggested I take a few days off. I told him I was fine. He told me I looked like I hadn't slept. He was right. But sleep wasn't the problem. The problem was that every time I closed my eyes, I saw tire tracks forming in sand that hadn't been disturbed yet. I went back out there 2 days later. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. I took a different cruiser, under the excuse of checking signage along the route. The desert looked the same as it always did, sun bleaching everything into harsh clarity. I drove slower than usual, scanning the shoulders, the stretches where pavement gave way to dirt. Nothing happened. For hours. By late afternoon, I started to feel foolish. Embarrassed even. I told myself the night had been a combination of isolation, static, and imagination. I told myself that if something truly unexplainable had happened, there would be evidence. There would be more reports. More sightings. Then, just as the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows, I saw it. A car pulled off on the side of the road ahead. Same color. Same shape. My pulse picked up, but I forced myself to stay calm. There are only so many sedans in the world. Coincidences happen. As I got closer, I saw the driver's door was open. The car was empty. I parked behind it and approached on foot, every sense tuned sharp and unpleasant. The interior was different this time. Messier. Fast food wrappers. A jacket on the passenger seat. A life inside it. The keys were not in the ignition. The engine was cold. Relief washed over me so fast it made my knees weak. This was real. A normal abandoned vehicle. I radioed it in and waited. While I waited, I noticed something small but wrong. The rearview mirror. It was angled down. Not fully. Just enough. I stepped back from the car and felt the heat of the day pressing in around me. The desert was loud now. Wind. Insects. The distant rush of passing vehicles. I told myself not to overthink it. Backup arrived. A younger officer. Fresh uniform. Curious eyes. We went through the standard checks. The owner turned out to be a college student who'd run out of gas and hitched a ride to the nearest town. Case closed. Except when the tow truck arrived. The driver paused and asked me something that made my stomach twist. He asked how long the car had been sitting there. I told him a couple of hours. He frowned and said the engine was still warm when he touched the hood. I went home that night and tried to sleep. I dreamed of the desert without roads. Of tire tracks that wrote themselves into the sand ahead of moving cars. Of mirrors that lifted to watch. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns. Reports of vehicles found intact but empty along isolated routes. No signs of theft. No signs of struggle. Keys present. Engines sometimes warm, sometimes not. I started keeping a private list. Dates. Locations. Vehicle types. They formed a loose curve on the map, arcing south and east, brushing the edges of the cholla fields like something tracing a boundary or expanding one. I didn't tell anyone about the list. I didn't tell anyone about the nights I started driving with my radio off, listening for engines that weren't there. And I definitely didn't tell anyone about the evening I came out of a gas station and found my cruiser sitting in the lot with the engine running, and the rearview mirror angled down toward the empty driver's seat. I told myself it was a mistake. I told myself it was exhaustion. Not real. Real. Not real. But the desert doesn't make mistakes. And it doesn't forget. After the gas station incident, I stopped telling myself things. That's not the same as accepting what was happening. It just meant I stopped trying to explain it away. Explanations require a kind of faith. Faith that reality behaves itself when you aren't looking. I no longer had that. I began sleeping in short stretches. An hour here, 2 hours there. Any longer than that and I'd wake up disoriented, convinced I was still in the cruiser. Convinced the hum I could hear was an engine idling somewhere, just out of sight. I started leaving lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because silence behaves differently when there's light. It feels less intentional. The list grew. I didn't mean for it to become what it did. It started as notes in the margins of my patrol log. Plate numbers that didn't sit right. Times that didn't align. Cars reported abandoned that had no business being where they were found. Then it became a notebook. Then two. Patterns emerged whether I wanted them to or not. The incidents clustered around the same stretches of highway, the same off-ramps, the same long, empty corridors that funneled toward the Cholla Desert. Always the same details. No witnesses who could say they saw someone get out of the vehicle. No evidence of theft. No clear timeline. Engines sometimes warm hours after being found. Mirrors often angled wrong. One report mentioned a car radio still playing. No station. Just a low hiss, punctuated by faint rhythmic clicks, like a turn signal that never engaged. I tried to ignore that one. I told myself I was assigning meaning where none existed. That I was seeing faces in the dark because I'd stared at it too long. Then I recognized a name on the list. A man who had gone missing years earlier. Not famous, not newsworthy. A construction worker who never came home from a late shift. His car had been found abandoned off a service road near the desert's edge. At the time, it was written off as a walkaway. He'd had problems. That's what the report said. People always have problems when they disappear. What the report didn't say was that his car had been found idling, or that the tire tracks around it showed no sign of approach or departure, or that the officer who found it had requested a transfer a month later and left the force entirely 6 months after that. I tracked down that officer, not officially. I drove to his last known address on a day I was supposed to be off duty. The house was empty, sun-bleached, the kind of place that looks abandoned long before it actually is. Neighbors said he'd moved without much notice, left most of his furniture behind. They said he'd started taking long drives at night before he left. I sat in my cruiser across the street and listened to the engine idle. I don't know how long I was there before I noticed my radio was on. I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the cab, low and constant. Under it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of another engine. Not synced to mine, just off enough to make my teeth ache. I shut the radio off and drove away. After that, the calls started coming in more frequently, or maybe I just noticed them more. Vehicles drifting, vehicles correcting themselves, vehicles slowing without braking. I volunteered for the night shifts without being asked. It felt important that if someone was going to see this again, it should be someone who already knew what to look for. I began recognizing the signs before anything obvious happened. The way headlights ahead would hold steady just a little too perfectly. The way a car would stay centered without the subtle sway of human correction. Once, late enough that the sky was nothing but stars and black, I followed a vehicle for nearly 10 miles without ever seeing the driver's head move. I pulled it over. The car stopped. I approached with my hand resting lightly on my holster, heart steady in a way that surprised me. The window rolled down. The driver was there. Alive. Breathing. Confused. I stepped back so quickly I nearly tripped. He asked if everything was okay. I told him he'd been drifting. He laughed and said he was just tired. I let him go. As I walked back to my cruiser, I glanced at his rearview mirror. It was angled straight back. Normal. I stood there longer than necessary, watching his taillights disappear, trying to understand why that felt like a loss. The desert started showing up in my dreams even when I wasn't sleeping. I'd catch myself staring at nothing, seeing stretches of sand overlaying the room I was in. The edge of my kitchen counter would blur into a roadside shoulder. The hum of my refrigerator would shift into something deeper. Once, brushing my teeth, I looked up and saw my reflection's eyes flick toward the mirror before I moved. I smashed the glass. I told my supervisor I needed time off. He didn't argue. I spent the first night of my leave sitting in my driveway, engine off, windows down, listening. Around 3 a.m, I heard it. An engine, not on the road, not nearby, behind my house. I didn't go looking for it. I sat there until dawn and told myself that was progress. A week later, I received an internal memo asking if I'd be willing to consult on a cold case review. Multiple abandoned vehicle reports being re-examined due to a new missing persons task force. The meeting room was small. The lights were too bright. The map on the wall made my chest tighten before I knew why. Someone had drawn a line through the desert. Not intentionally. They'd connected cases by date and location, trying to establish jurisdictional overlap. The line curved toward the cholla. I asked who had drawn it. No one answered. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind and stared at the map until the room emptied. The silence pressed in the way it did at night, heavy and watchful. I reached out and traced the line with my finger. It felt warm. I pulled my hand back and laughed softly at myself. Not real. Real. Not real. That night I dreamed I was standing on the highway, watching a car drive past with no one inside. As it passed, I saw my own face in the driver's seat. Eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel. I woke up in my bed, heart racing, certain I could hear an engine idling somewhere in the house. When I finally got up and checked the garage, my cruiser wasn't there. I don't mean it had been stolen. I mean the space where it should have been was empty, clean, undisturbed, like it had never existed at all. My phone rang as I stood there staring. Dispatch. Asking why Unit 7 hadn't checked in yet. I told dispatch they had the wrong unit. The words came out automatically, the way you answer when someone asks your name in a place you don't belong. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Unit 7. Dispatch repeated. Your cruiser shows active. Location ping places you southbound near route, __. I was standing barefoot in my garage. The concrete was cool under my feet. The shelves were exactly where they'd always been. The faint oil stain near the back wall hadn't changed shape in years. I looked at it like it might suddenly rearrange itself. I told dispatch I was at home. They didn't respond right away. When they did, the voice sounded careful. The way people sound when they're deciding whether to escalate something. Unit 7. We show you in motion. I hung up. I stood there listening to the quiet of my house. The kind of quiet that settles in when you live alone. No engine. No radio. No wind. Not real. Real. Not real. I went back inside and sat at my kitchen table, hands flat on the surface, grounding myself in the texture of the wood. I waited for my phone to ring again. It didn't. An hour passed. Then another. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the call. If the list, the map, the missing cruiser were all symptoms of a mind finally breaking under too many nights alone. Then, I heard it. Not from inside the house. From outside. An engine idling at the curb. Slow. Steady. familiar. I stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. My heart hammered as I moved toward the front window, careful to stay back from the glass. My cruiser was parked on the street, lights off, engine running. For a long moment, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It felt like looking at a photograph that had been edited slightly wrong. Everything was there, but something essential was missing. The driver's seat was empty. I stepped onto the porch. The morning air felt too still, like the desert at night had followed me home. The engine sound filled the space between the houses, intimate and intrusive. I walked toward the cruiser. With each step, the certainty grew heavier in my chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The rearview mirror was angled down. I stopped a few feet from the driver's door. The smell of warm metal and dust reached me, unmistakable. This wasn't a hallucination. It had weight, heat, presence. The radio inside crackled. I heard my own voice say my call sign. Then something else. A pause. A faint, breath-like sound that didn't belong to any transmission protocol I'd ever known. I opened the door. The interior looked untouched. No sign of struggle. No sign of entry. The seat still held the impression of someone who'd been sitting there recently. Fabric creased and warm. I reached up and adjusted the mirror back to its proper position. It resisted, just slightly, like pushing against a hand that didn't want to let go. I jerked my arm back and shut the door hard enough to rattle the frame. That was when I understood something I hadn't let myself think before. This wasn't following cars. It was learning routes, learning habits, learning me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report the cruiser's return. I got in and drove. Not toward the station, not toward anywhere familiar. I drove south, back toward the highway, back toward the stretch of road where this had started. The cruiser responded perfectly. Engine smooth, steering precise. Too precise. As the city fell away and the desert opened up again, the radio turned itself on. Static. Then my voice, calm and steady, reading off a location. A location I recognized. The edge of the cholla field. I took my hands off the wheel. The cruiser stayed centered. Not real. Real. Not real. The road signs blurred past. The sun climbed higher. The desert waited, vast and patient. I realized then that I was no longer certain whether I was driving the cruiser, or if the cruiser was simply letting me come along. I don't remember deciding to stop. One moment the road was still unspooling ahead of me, the familiar ribbon of asphalt cutting through scrub and stone, and the next the cruiser was slowing, easing toward the shoulder with the same calm deliberation I had seen in the sedan weeks earlier. I hadn't touched the pedals. I hadn't touched anything. The cruiser rolled to a stop at the exact place where the pavement began to crumble into sand. Not a marked turnout, not an intersection, just a place where the road quietly gave up. The engine kept running. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, because that felt important. Because putting them anywhere else felt like an admission. The radio hissed softly, then settled into silence. No voice, no static. Just the low hum of power moving through a system that didn't need me anymore. I opened the door and stepped out. The desert was bright, unforgiving in daylight. The cholla field stretched ahead, dense and hostile, every spine outlined in sharp relief. In the sun it looked almost ordinary, ugly even. Something you'd warn people away from without ever imagining it could hold anything else. But I knew better now. I walked around the cruiser slowly, inspecting it the way I would any vehicle after an incident. Tires intact. No sand packed into the treads. No scratches along the sides. No sign it had gone anywhere it shouldn't have. The hood was warm. I leaned against it and closed my eyes. For a moment, I let myself pretend that if I stayed still long enough, this would pass. That I could call someone. That there was still a version of this where I went home and slept and woke up to a world that behaved itself. Then, I felt it, a vibration through the metal. Not the steady rhythm of an idling engine. Something subtler, irregular, like a pulse searching for alignment. I stepped back. The vibration stopped. The desert was quiet, but not empty. I had the uncomfortable sense that the space around me was crowded with attention. Not watching, exactly. Waiting. I walked toward the edge of the cholla field. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was resisting me. The heat pressed in from all sides, but there was a narrow band of cool air just ahead, hovering at the boundary where the sand gave way to cactus. I stopped there. The cholla stood shoulder to shoulder, an impenetrable wall of spines and shadows. Light filtered through in broken patterns, creating pockets of darkness that felt deeper than they should have been in full sun. I saw movement, not in the way people expect. No figures, no shapes crossing gaps, just a subtle adjustment, as if something inside the field was shifting its weight. I took another step forward and immediately felt it. That same wrong cold. It wrapped around my ankle like a breath held too long. I froze. The sensation didn't spread. It didn't pull. It just stayed there, acknowledging me. Not real. Real. Not real. I heard the engine behind me change pitch. I turned slowly. The cruiser was still where I'd left it, but the front wheels were angled now, pointed toward the cholla. The headlights flicked on without sound, their beams cutting into the field and illuminating the narrow path where the sedan had vanished that first night. A path I was certain hadn't been there a moment before. The radio crackled again. This time, it wasn't my voice. It was quieter, thinner, like a transmission degraded by distance and time. Unit 7, do you see it? I shook my head, even though no one could see me. I backed away from the cholla and toward the cruiser, every instinct screaming that distance mattered, that proximity was a choice I couldn't undo once made. As I reached the driver's door, I caught my reflection in the window. For a split second, it didn't match. The eyes were wrong. Too still. Too focused on something behind me. I blinked and it corrected itself. I opened the door and climbed in. The seat accepted my weight easily, as if it had been waiting. The steering wheel felt warm beneath my hands, textured and familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. The radio hissed. Then my voice again, softer this time. Proceed. I didn't know where. The cruiser lurched forward, not fast, not slow. I watched the edge of the road slip past, the pavement dissolving into sand beneath the tires. The steering wheel turned gently in my hands, guiding us toward the path through the cholla. I tried to pull against it. The resistance was immediate and firm, not forceful but absolute, like trying to turn against a locked joint. I let go. The cruiser continued on its own. The cholla closed in around us, branches brushing the sides without scraping, spines missing the paint by impossible margins. The path ahead stayed clear, opening just enough to allow passage, then closing behind us. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road was gone. Not hidden. Gone. Just cholla where the road should have been, dense and unbroken, as if no vehicle had ever passed that way. My breathing grew shallow. Each inhale felt like it might be my last chance to take one. Not real. Real. Not real. The engine sound changed again, syncing with something else. A deeper rhythm layered beneath it, resonating through the frame of the cruiser and into my bones. I realized then that the cruiser wasn't alone. We weren't following the path. We were part of it. The path widened ahead, opening into a small clearing I didn't recognize. The ground there was darker, compacted, marked by impressions that overlapped and intersected in ways that made my head ache if I looked too closely. Tire tracks. Many of them. Different sizes, Different ages. All ending here. The cruiser stopped. The engine idled. The radio fell silent. I sat there, staring at the clearing. Understanding settling over me not as a thought but as a weight. This was where they ended up. Not disappeared. Arrived. I don't know how long I sat there before the mirror began to move again. Slowly. Deliberately. Tilting down. Toward the empty space behind my seat. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The last thing I remember clearly is the feeling of the seat shifting beneath me, adjusting, as if accommodating someone else. After that, things blur. Sounds without sources. Movements without direction. The sense of being both inside and outside myself at the same time. When I came back to awareness, the cruiser was parked on the shoulder of the highway. Engine off. Keys in the ignition. The desert looked ordinary again, too ordinary. I was alone. I think. I drove home. Without incident. I didn't check the mirrors. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't look back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm sitting very still, I feel a vibration beneath the floor. And I know something is idling. Waiting for me to finish this. I don't know why I'm recording this now. I've started this account more times than I can count. Files saved and deleted. Recordings cut short because my voice sounded wrong to my own ears, like I was listening to someone practicing how to sound like me. Each time I told myself there was no point. That nothing good comes from naming things that already know you exist. But lately, the waiting has changed. It's closer now. I'm not on the force anymore. That part is public record, neat and boring in a way that almost feels insulting. Early retirement. Psychological evaluation. No incident listed as the cause. Just a quiet exit after decades of service. Like I faded out instead of stepping away. People still recognize me sometimes. Former co-workers. Clerks at gas stations along the old routes. They ask how retirement suits me. They ask if I miss the road. I tell them no. That's true, in a way. I don't miss the road. The road remembers me. I moved houses twice, first closer to town. Then, farther out. I thought distance mattered. I thought changing my routine would break whatever pattern had formed. But patterns don't care about intention. The first house had a garage. Every morning I'd wake up convinced I'd hear an engine when I opened the door. I never did. Not there. But I did find the radio in my kitchen turning itself on at odd hours, always tuned to empty frequencies. Static. Clicking. The suggestion of rhythm. The second house didn't have a garage. I thought that would help. It didn't. I stopped driving at night. Then I stopped driving altogether. Groceries delivered. Appointments scheduled early. Curtains drawn before sunset. I learned how to live small. How to make myself predictable in harmless ways, hoping that would be enough. It wasn't. Sometimes I wake up, and my feet are dirty. Like I've been walking barefoot outside. Fine sand in the creases of my skin. Tiny cactus spines embedded so shallow they don't hurt until I notice them. I don't remember leaving the house. I stopped checking the mirrors years ago. That might sound dramatic, but it's practical. Mirrors imply reflection. Reflection implies confirmation. And I've learned that confirmation cuts both ways. I know better than to look for things that are already looking for me. The list is gone now. The notebooks disappeared one by one. Not all at once. Gradually. A page missing here. A name I know I wrote no longer there. Eventually. Just blank paper. I took that as a message. The task force disbanded. The cases stayed unsolved. People still vanish along those roads, but no one connects them anymore. The reports are shorter now. Less detail. Less curiosity. I can't blame them. Curiosity is what gets you followed. I've tried to convince myself that this ends with me. That whatever learned my roots, my habits, my voice, has no use for me anymore. that I was a test case, an anomaly. Something that slipped through and corrected itself. But correction implies an error. And I'm not sure that's what this was. There are nights when I hear a car pass my house and feel something shift in my chest. A reflex too ingrained to fade. I'll sit very still and count the seconds between the sound approaching and the sound leaving, listening for irregularities. Sometimes the sound doesn't leave. Sometimes it just idles. I've learned not to look out the window when that happens. Learn not to check the street. Learn not to listen too closely. Because once, I did. Just once. The car wasn't one I recognized. Not mine. Not any model I could name. It sat at the curb with its lights off, engine humming softly, like it didn't want to disturb the neighborhood. There was no one inside. I knew that without seeing it. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor until morning. When I checked again, it was gone. No tire tracks. No oil stains. Nothing. People talk about the desert like it's empty, but that's only true if you define empty as lacking people. The land remembers everything else. Every movement. Every mistake. Every repetition. I think that's why this worked there. Not because it's barren. Because it's patient. I still get calls sometimes. Not phone calls. Not exactly. Moments where I'll hear my name spoken softly, just out of sync with the room I'm in. Reflections that lag half a second too long. Shadows that stretch where they shouldn't. Not real. Real. Not real. I've started leaving my keys in the same place every night. On the table by the door. I don't know why I do it. It just feels important. Like a boundary. Like an offering. The last time I tried to get rid of them, I found them back on the table the next morning, warm. I don't sleep much anymore. When I do, I dream of roads without markings, stretching into pale distances where the sky meets the ground without ever touching. I dream of mirrors adjusting themselves, of engines sinking, of sitting in the passenger seat, watching my hands move on the wheel without me telling them to. If you're listening to this and wondering why I didn't fight harder, why I didn't expose this, why I didn't force someone to believe me, then you still think belief is the point. It isn't. Witness is. I think that's what this wants. Not secrecy. Not fear. Continuation. I think every time someone listens, every time someone imagines the road at night and wonders what might be driving beside them, the path gets a little clearer. I don't know what happens when the path is finished. I only know that lately, when I sit in silence, I can feel the vibration again. Stronger than before. Close enough that the floor hums beneath my feet. Like something parked just outside, like something waiting for me to stop talking. If this cuts off abruptly, don't assume anything happened. Or do. The desert doesn't need witnesses forever. Just long enough. Not real. Real. Not real.